march of time. The undismayed idealism of Upton Sinclair, California's proponent of utopia, is as much a part of the West Coast character as the aggressiveness of Harry Bridges, who denounces his enemies as scabs and finks, Trotskyites and fascist appeasers. The enterprise and energy which built the Golden West are reflected in the movie industry, which within 10 fantastic years rocketed from a shoestring speculation into a multi-million-dollar business, and even, when touched by genius, into a great and timeless popular art. The movie industry, itself a part of the West's colorful history, has done much to keep this history alive, to memorialize the driving energy and adventurous spirit of the pioneers. In dramatizing the building of the railroad, which first linked the West to the industrial East, the movies have recorded a pivotal era in U.S. history. The huge scale on which the movie industry today functions and the calculated lavishness with which it spends money are in keeping with the Pacific Coast's grandiose tradition. Even in a land where big jobs command big pay, movie salaries, frequently hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, have become legendary. And to the West Coast, the swift rise of this industry is proof that bigness of concept and boldness of planning are things that pay off.
There are two Hollywoods. One is a place where everyone is part of a sort of expansive, creative family, happily beavering away to produce the films that entertain people across the globe. In that Hollywood, even the shameful episodes of its own history become glossy blockbusters. So, for example, the infamous HUAC Blacklists are presented as either a fairly minor kerfuffle or an episode that was, sort of against everything the USA stands for, and hey, isn't the USA great after all for finally acknowledging that whole nasty affair? But the Blacklists destroyed the careers of many thousands of people, not just the high-profile actors and screenwriters, but hundreds of union activists across the many trades that make Hollywood tick. From electricians to carpenters, from painters to office receptionists. Make no mistake, Hollywood is and always has been an industrial town. And for decades, under the Blacklists, an open collusion between studio employers and right-wing forces kept many ordinary workers from finding employment in the very industry that their town was built on. The Blacklists were also a shattering defeat in the fight for democratic unionism in Hollywood. Through the 1930s and 1940s, as an era renowned as the golden age of Hollywood, union activists inside those studios fought a 20-year war for control of their own unions. And in this drawn-out struggle, they confronted a vicious, three-headed enemy. First, there were the studio bosses, a band of union-busting class warriors. And then there were the infamous Los Angeles cops, given carte blanche to use any force necessary to maim and murder leftists. And finally, there was the LA section of Al Capone's Chicago gang, who took over the Hollywood unions at gunpoint. And this, then, is the other Hollywood. The Hollywood they've never revealed on the big screen. It was a place of fierce class war, of courage and sacrifice, of collective struggle and political organising. And at the centre of all of this were a group of communists and their fellow travellers. From a small, informal network through the 1920s, the Hollywood branch of the Communist Party was only officially launched in 1937, at a time when the party was far removed from its revolutionary heyday. But it was still able then to draw radicals into its orbit, and within 3 years it was the biggest branch outside the party's New York heartland. The Hollywood Communists' history is one of heroism, but also one of tragedy, of path-forging struggle on the one hand and outright political bankruptcy on the other. Let's take a look to begin from this excerpt from David Gill's acclaimed 1980s series, Hollywood.
Easterners had other curious ways. On vacant lots, they built wooden platforms. These open stages were as basic as the rooftops of New York and depended as much on sunshine.
We used old buildings, barns, anything available that would house our equipment. We had no electric light. They were all open-air shots. When it was raining, there'd be a rush to grab a piece of furniture and get it in out of the rain until the rain would pass, and then we'd put it out again, shoot a few scenes.
Up where the wires were, they would put canvas so they could pull it across. In case you had an interior, the sun wouldn't be shining down on the table and casting shadows. We managed, but the wind would blow the tablecloth and things that shouldn't be blowing, but people didn't mind.
With a backyard and a bungalow, you could build a studio. And you had your own picture company.
There were no unions, no casting organizations, none of the order and regimentation we have today. So people gathered at the gates to see if they could get work, a few people. And if our gates were not available or not open, they'd rush off to the next little place where they had a gate.
We would sometimes be at the studio till 8 or 10 o'clock at night and walk home and stand on the corner and talk about pictures and how to do this and overacting and overexposure and all these things for 2 and 3 hours.
The pictures that you worked on in those days, the money wasn't there. There was no union, so there was no time. You worked Sundays and holidays, no extra pay. But it was a family. It was a very close-knitted group of people. Everybody would help each other. They wouldn't try to hinder you or push you down. It was just everybody would work. And it was fun. It was real fun.
None of us felt that we were out here permanently. We all felt that we'd probably be sent back to New York, you know, to the studios back there. So the Hollywood Hotel was the only place to live at that time. And we'd stay at the hotel until we'd find a house to rent for maybe 6 months. And after that was up, the rent was up, or the 6 months was up, back to the Hollywood Hotel we'd go.
Now that video gives some flavour for those early days, and it also obviously highlights the total lack of union activism and union presence. But the picture was far less rosy even than that documentary would have you believe. Los Angeles' status as the flag bearer for anti-union employers was precisely what drew the studios there from their birthplace in New Jersey, with dozens operating in LA by 1916. The theatrical mechanics union who had formed a national, the theatrical mechanics who had formed a national union in the 1890s became the first generation of cinema projectionists. In the face of extreme hostility from the studio heads, they then used that foothold to unionize across other crafts inside the studios. Their union, the International Alliance of Theatrical and Stage Employees, IATSE, or just IA, competed with two other craft unions, the IBEW and the Carpenters Union. Studio heads refused to recognize any of these unions, and unfortunately, all three of those unions were pretty rotten or had pretty rotten behavior at times in their battle for jurisdiction. For example, on the occasions where one did take strike action, it was not unusual for the others to openly scab on that union. Needless to say, management loved this whole setup. It kept wages low and working conditions fast and deadly. Meanwhile, the theatre union Actors' Equity had recruited over 1,000 Hollywood film actors by 1921, almost entirely among the lowest paid bit part players and extras. But the studios refused to recognise equity, and that union totally failed to deliver on safety, job security, and even on wages in the new cinema industry. But the industry is about to undergo a revolution.
1927, a new era in motion pictures is about to begin. For the first time, natural sound, dialogue, and singing will be used in a feature film, The Jazz Singer, to star Al Jolson. George Jessel, who played the role on the stage, is at first offered the part, turns it down, gives Jolson his opportunity to make film history. Jack L. Warner, president of Warner Brothers, tells of those days.
In the 1920s, silent motion pictures were strongly established as popular entertainment. They had come a long way from the novelty of 1 and 2 reel films to feature-length productions which told sustained stories. There was a general belief at that time that motion pictures had progressed as far as they could go as a medium of dramatic expression and satisfying entertainment. My brothers and I believed otherwise. We were determined to break the barrier of silence and bring full life to the screen by giving it a voice that would be heard around the world. To this goal, we dedicated the full resources of Warner Brothers. This was an all-out effort with the future of our company at stake and possibly with the destiny of the motion pictures in the balance. There were setbacks and discouragements and a great deal of criticism from doubters who were annoyed with us for not letting well enough alone. Many said in public statements that talking pictures were a novelty and wouldn't last 30 days. But then on the night of October 6, 1927, came the full realization of everything we had set out to do. With the New York premiere of The Jazz Singer, and speaking from the screen, Al Jolson uttered the never-to-be-forgotten line, "You ain't heard nothing yet." Warner Brothers had given the screen its voice, and a vast new horizon for motion pictures was really open.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? All right, hold on. Lou, listen. Play Toot Toot Tootsie. 3 choruses, you understand? And the 3rd chorus, I whistle. Now give it to him hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Toot Toot Tootsie, goodbye. Toot Toot Tootsie, don't cry.
The rush begins. As more and more theaters become wired for sound, stage-trained actors, directors, and writers flock to Hollywood. Although The Jazz Singer contains only 291 spoken words and is at first not accepted by the trade press, the public at large has taken the new talking phenomenon to its heart. Frantically, producers struggle to finish silent films still in production before it is too late. The onrush of sound creates technical problems. Hand-cranked cameras have to be replaced by motor-driven ones for uniform speed. High-amp lighting gives off a crackling sound that will be picked up by the sensitive microphone. One of the last great non-talking films, the Fox production of Sunrise, ingeniously compensates for the absence of the spoken word by use of musical effects. Once the free-roaming master of the screen, the camera is now back to its primitive, immobile state. Only now it is enclosed in a soundproofed sweatbox to muffle the noise made by the camera motor. Cameramen are literally parboiled. Actors are forced to stay close to the single microphone. The sound man is king, the cameraman and performers his slaves. 1928, the first all-talkie, Warner's Lights of New York. Primitive today, with the microphone concealed in the telephone.
I planted the stuff in Eddie's shop. Yeah? And the Dicks will be there at 10 o'clock. Uh-huh. But they must not find Eddie. Don't you understand? What you mean? Take him for a ride. Oh.
In just over a decade since its birth, the film industry in Hollywood had become the center of film production worldwide. Producers would boast that 80% of global film output came from this one town. The arrival of sound in 1927 wasn't some shock. The studios had been gearing up for this for years, each one determined to be the first to market. But now film crews were bigger than ever before. Increasing competition and the rising costs of production were muscling out the smaller studios. A frenzied wave of acquisitions and mergers marked the whole period, and by the time of the great financial crash at the end of the decade, just 8 studios, known as the majors, had consolidated in their hands practically the whole of Hollywood. Within these 8, there were 2 bands, the so-called Big Five, which consisted of Paramount, MGM, Fox, Warner's, and RKO, and the Little Three, which were Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. All of this potentially strengthened the hand of the unions, and management knew it. In 1926, the majors signed up to Hollywood's first Studio Basic Agreement. It was the outcome of unprecedented unity between the studio unions, who'd campaigned together for an agreement that would set benchmark minimum pay and conditions across the industry. So this was a victory of sorts. But that SBA was also really only a promise to recognise the unions, not a genuine agreement. And all the negotiations under this agreement would be conducted by AFL officials in New York City, without any input from rank and file members in Hollywood. Next, the studio heads turned their attention to heading off the unionisation of the so-called talent. To this end, the head of MGM, Louis B. Mayer, you can see on the screen now, developed an ingenious plan. The major studios would establish a professional body that would manage disputes and make rulings on pay and conditions without all of that messy business of unions, and even without courts and lawyers. And this body would only be open to the so-called best of the film industry, the real talent. And they'd even offer awards to those who were judged to be the best in their craft each year. But most importantly for the studio heads, this body would be registered as the legitimate sole bargaining agent of the employees. Basically a company union, and an exceptionally brazen one at that. The actors, with their egos in particular, lapped this up. And thus, in early 1927, just a couple of months after signing the Studio Basic Agreement, Hollywood launched the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, usually known as just the Academy. It is perhaps the most weirdly popular union-busting exercise in history. Now, let us turn our attention beyond Hollywood itself, because it sits within the broader context of LA. And in particular, I want to look at the radical left in LA. The Communist Party had grown significantly through the 1920s, and in particular, they had managed to recruit among the city's multiracial working class. You can see from the signs and the placards in this shot. The party was also subjected to extremely violent repression at the hands of the Red Squad, and you'll hear about that in these first-hand accounts from CP activist Elaine Spiro, whose then husband worked in one of the studios. And also you'll hear CP organiser Dorothy Healy. Now, I've cut their interviews over the top of footage from the National Hunger Marches across the country, which was shot by the Communist Film Unit, the Workers' Film and Photo League.
In 1930, when the Depression really started, Eddie was still working and getting $80 a week. And if he worked overtime, it was more, which was quite a bit of money. So I was still the friends came over one day and they were arguing about the Depression, that Eddie better, join the left-wing trade union movement, because the AFL certainly wasn't doing anything, and he knows that. And if they ever found out, that he was talking to someone, he might lose his job. He was a foreman, a machinist foreman in the studios at the time. And so we made a date. I believe it was February the 28th, which is fast approaching now, and this is 1930, so you see that's a good many years ago, 46 years ago, to meet these people after a demonstration, not during the demonstration, on a Saturday, and we would go to a show, first have dinner out and then go to a show. This particular person now lives in Mill Valley and is very affluent.
I know who it is.
And his
Meyer.
And his wife was then working for the Travelers' Aid, so that there was a steady income in there, and he himself was a full-time organizer. And we had arguments. I said, "Oh, you provoked the police." He says, "Well, if they come and they break up the meeting, they don't let us speak." I said, "Those probably some of the things that you're saying, and maybe somebody standing in the background and kicking them or something, just arguing with him, that it wasn't altogether, the police couldn't be as bad as he said they were, including the Red Squad." And which was under the jurisdiction of Captain Hines. And
yeah, they called him Red Hines, didn't
Red
they?
Hines, yes, Red Hines, Hynes. And no, I wasn't going to go to that demonstration, but we would meet him afterwards. We would see that someone, we'd take Joyce over to Mother's and leave her there for the night. And so we went down to the place, the plaza, to meet this couple, and lo and behold, we found the place looking like a shambles, like there must have been a fight, torn umbrellas, boxes that were broken, and papers torn, and it looked like there must have been some struggle there. And we went looking for this couple, and we couldn't find him. We went all around the plaza, we went across the street to the church, couldn't see him. And then finally we saw his wife, and she also looked like she was walking around. She had worked that day and was coming and looking, and she says, "I understand there were some arrests here, and I don't see anybody here." She says, "I've been walking around to see where the car might be parked. Not that I have a key, but at least see where it's parked if it's here." And so she says, "Do you mind walking over with us, with me, to First Street?" I've forgotten the name of the building now. And see if they know where Meyer is. And so we walked up there. We went up to the third floor, I believe, and that was the ILD, the International Labor Defense Office, and it was dark. See, by then it was dark in February at 5:30.
Yeah.
6 it was dark. So she said, "Do you mind walking down to the first floor? There's another office there, and he might be there." So we went down there, and that was the party headquarters, the Communist Party headquarters, and there were about 25 people there, including her husband. And along the windowsill, there were about 10 Japanese sitting there, and all of them that were coming in were congratulating one man who was, I'm 4'11" in my stocking feet, he I think was that short, and they were all saying, "Beautiful job, Hata, a beautiful job, Hata." And I didn't know what they're talking about. It seemed that they saw this cop, who was about 6 foot tall, coming at a worker from the back with his club raised, and he used some jiu-jitsu on him, and just floored that big cop so that the person didn't get his brain splashed, and was able to get away. But the thing was that you could see that there was no forethought about. After a demonstration of that nature, and because of this policeman being knocked off, people who were in the patrol wagon already were able to go out. Well, instead of dispersing, they dispersed to the party headquarters.
Oh, I see. So nobody had been arrested, huh?
There had been a few arrested in one patrol wagon, but then the others, including Meyer, hadn't been. I kept saying, let's go, and just a minute. Meyer would say, just a minute, I want to see so-and-so. And there were people there that I didn't know. The only one I knew was Meyer, and of course his wife who came up there with us. And just as I was saying, let's go, we're going to be late, the door flung open, and you're not going anywhere. And there was the red spot. I didn't know who they were, with sawed-off guns pointing at us.
Oh, my God.
Sit down where you're at. Well, and in the corner, there was an older white woman with a boyish bob, rather heavy set. And she was standing, and they said, sit. And they about took and tossed her up against that chair so that it broke under her, and she just lay on the ground, on the floor.
So you get a real sense of, the images give you a sense of the time and what Unita says there about, the nature of their organizing, the kind of anger amongst the working class, and that repression dealt out by cops in LA, and the Red Squad in particular, with sawn-off shotguns and stuff. The end of the Depression saw a sharp upturn in worker struggle across the US, with major mass strikes like the Minneapolis Teamsters strike, the Toledo Auto Workers strike, and the San Francisco Longshoremen strike. In each of those strikes, in particular, the leadership was in the hands of organized political radicals, most notably, in this case for us, the Trotskyists in Minneapolis. I want to show you a bit about this, and you can hear more. You can find out more about them if you take a look at some of our books and other items on the Red Flag website. This little clip gives you a sense of what was happening as the class struggle rose up again at the end of the Depression.
Here are the first pictures of strike-paralyzed San Francisco in the grip of a general labor tie-up. Streets are deserted as surface cars cease running, and citizens unable to travel remain indoors. Only a few automobiles can operate because most filling stations have exhausted their supplies and can obtain no more gasoline. Motor trucks stand idle where their drivers left them. Very little food is being moved into the city, and with the threat of famine before them, crowds jam the markets. But supplies dwindle rapidly, and there is no meat to be had. To the possibility of mob violence is added fear of pestilence, while on every hand closed shops give mute testimony to the disastrous economic consequence of the strike. Open warfare rages through the streets of the city as 3,000 Union pickets battle 700 police. Guns, tear gas, clubs, and fists bring injuries to more than 80 persons and cause the death of 2. Listen to the strikers' side of the story.
We are asking for a general strike to keep organized labor on the Pacific Coast. We are not only asking for it, but we're going to get it.
These pictures of the Minneapolis truck drivers' strike, typical of disorders flaring up in various cities, show a spirit of lawlessness which has no place in America. 5,000 are in the milling mob, trying to prevent trucks from delivering needed food to the city. A strong guard of police and distribution of nightsticks to citizen deputies fails to check the crowd, which closes in an ugly move. Outnumbering the police 10 to 1, they attack in gangs, the actual beginning of hand-to-hand fighting, in which one deputy was beaten to death and scores were injured.
So, again, that gives you a flavor for what's happening by the time we get to 34. In Hollywood, at that stage, the only radical political party was the Communist Party. And they were then in that process of shifting from their mad sort of third period policy to the very conservative Popular Front period. Compounding that problem, at this time, the CP in LA had no real interest in organizing among Hollywood labor. They prioritized instead organizing along in the docks and agricultural workers. So the party didn't actually establish a Hollywood branch until 1937. But in 1933, there were a scattering of CP members in Hollywood, and they played the key role in founding the Screenwriters Guild. And this reflected the party's interest in, even though they weren't organizing industrially in Hollywood, they did at least want to organize the so-called above-the-line workers. That is, the people whose names appeared, at the top of the film credits. And, just as importantly, those names that appeared in the liberal press. Tells you a lot about the CP. Of all the CP members working in Hollywood, over 80% of them were above-the-line talent. This next excerpt comes from a video that the Screenwriters Guild produced and presents to their new members when you join. They would actually sit you down in a room and make you watch this video about the union's history. And this was the case practiced right up until the 80s, as far as I know. In this video, you'll hear communists Lester Cole and John Bright discussing their role in founding the Guild. Most of the other people mentioned here were also communists, notably John Howard Lawson, the party's Hollywood head. We can say that now because, of course, for many decades in Hollywood, you would not have named names like I just did. So we're kind of reclaiming some of these people for the left.
In 1933, the major studios were claiming they were in serious financial trouble. There were reports of impending shutdowns, which could only be averted by studio personnel taking stiff wage cuts. The technical workers were unionized, and they defied any proposed cuts with the threat of a strike. The studios then turned to the non-organized talent categories.
This executive out from New York made a brief and passionate speech. He told us what trouble the company was in, and that all the trouble was the fault of those damn unions, because they had to make contracts, and those contracts bound them. They couldn't cut their salaries, so they had to turn to us as loyal, patriotic Americans. Well, Brian Marlowe, an associate of mine there, a writer, and I, as we were walking out, we looked at each other. He said, that's the answer. You've got to have a union. So let's get back to the office and let's make some calls.
One of the writers they found receptive was a flamboyant and successful 25-year-old named John Bright. In The Public Enemy, Bright wrote with a forceful social awareness. In some respects, he almost seems to be commenting on the dilemma of screenwriters.
Cheaper than yours. All right, screw. You can sell ours for the same price.
There was widespread nepotism, purely arbitrary allocation of credits, no protection at all. I determined, along with 9 others, to inaugurate a program that for the writers to organize around.
On February 3rd, Bright met Lester Cole and Brian Marlowe at the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel. 7 other writers joined them, several of whom had been active in establishing the Dramatists Guild in the New York Theater and saw the need for a similar effort in Hollywood. The idea of a writers' union was quickly embraced. It took only a few weeks to gather some 500 writers for the first formal meeting, held at the old Writers Club building at 6700 Sunset Boulevard.
And the idea was to get the writers to commit themselves not to take any cut in salary until we got recognized. But anyone who did took a cut in salary from the producers could not be a member of this Writers Guild.
Well-known playwright John Howard Lawson was elected the first president. There were 173 founding members who contributed not only their enthusiasm, but just as importantly, their money, the equivalent of over $1,000 each.
A good number of the formation group that were responsible for the beginnings of the Guild were established and capable and prosperous writers, and that they contributed money as well as their time and risked their employment in order to establish the Guild to a considerable degree, help those that didn't have the clout.
Sonia Levine, Lillian Hellman, Dorothy Parker. I think they truly envisioned that the time must come that we must have representation. And I think the little guys that came in needed it. And I know it sounds corny to say they were altruistic, but I believe they were.
And it got back to Thalberg and Schulberg and all the others practically at once. They knew it. And almost immediately started to screen Reds.
A reasonable number of writers that regarded themselves as slightly above the common herd, that they were artists, and therefore should have nothing to do with labor organization as such.
This is what Irving Thalberg said somewhat later. He said, "You're not plumbers, you're artists. And artists don't need unions." And this was at a time that he said that when plumbers were making more than the artists were.
When Jack Warner heard that I was on this awful thing called the Screenwriters Guild, he said, unless you get off this damn nonsense, you're fired. Well, it so happened that Warner Brothers had picked up my option a couple of weeks before, and so I had to tell Jack Warner that I thanked him very much. He made it possible for me now to work for the next 40 weeks for the Guild on the Warner Brothers payroll.
The next 3 years were a period of bitter deadlock as the studios refused to recognize the Guild. In May of 1935, Roosevelt's NRA was declared unconstitutional, which weakened the Guild's position. That summer, Congress passed another New Deal measure, the Wagner Labor Relations Act. It established the National Labor Relations Board, guaranteeing the workers of eligible industries the right to choose a union by majority vote. A short time later, the Guild's opposition nearly succeeded in destroying it.
See, the Guild first started really as a social club with Rupert Hughes and those people. Those were not really Guild members. The crunch came when the studios decided to fight the Guild, and the social element became the leaders of the screen playwrights.
The Guild's predecessor was the Writers' Club. Many of its members, such as Rupert Hughes, James McGinnis, and Patterson McNutt, had opposed the very concept of a writers' union. They were themselves politically conservative, and since most worked at MGM, were closely allied with Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. After gaining seats on the Guild Executive Board, McGinnis and McNutt abruptly resigned. They and 125 others then announced the formation of the Screen Playwrights, a rival organization which had clearly been in preparation for some time.
Because when they announced that they were ready, they had a constitution, they had the whole thing set up, and 24 hours later, people were signing in.
The Screen Playwrights never numbered more than about 150. Nevertheless, they were a formidable opponent.
Members of the Screen Playwrights were hired and got paid, and they also saw to it that members of the Screenwriters Guild were not hired.
The threat was there that when your option came up, if you were a member of the Guild, you'd have to have some very big successes to be renewed.
Well, I was the chairman of the negotiating committee, and we had some very stormy meetings with the producers. One stormy session, Harry Warner gave expression to some obscenities, and Eddie Mannix at our next bargaining meeting wanted to set the record straight and said that he didn't mean what he said when he told us that he would fire anyone who was subversive from the studio. And we said that sounded like a blacklist. And Harry Warner, who wasn't at the meeting, Jack Warner was at the meeting, at the second meeting, said, oh no blacklist. There would never be a blacklist at Warner Brothers. We'd do it all by the telephone.
At this time, the House Un-American Activities Committee made its first foray into Hollywood under the chairmanship of Martin Dies. It marked the beginning of the witch hunts, which would eventually blur any distinction between anti-fascism, liberalism, communism, and just plain outspokenness. The studios took advantage of the publicity, saying they would not sign a contract with subversives.
In addition to the radical writers, actors, and directors, there were a handful of communists through the 30s working inside the studios as below-the-line workers. Jeff Keeber, for example, was a communist working as a prop maker since 1934 after graduating from UCLA. Despite the party's reluctance to organise studio workers, Keeber was persistent, adopting the attitude that a good communist organises wherever they are. He wrote once of the film industry that within this world of fantasy are thousands of workers of all kinds who sweat and who fight the same bitter struggles as other thousands of workers to secure a decent livelihood. Alongside Keeber was another key communist, Irving Henschel. Henschel was a machinist who'd never finished high school. He was a middle-aged man from a working-class Jewish background who'd received his education in the party, and he was a tireless organizer. That's him there in a cameo from the fantastic 1954 film Salt of the Earth, made by blacklisted crews who were driven out of Hollywood later on in the 50s. The end of the Depression, we're going to come back to those two important figures in a second. The end of the Depression also marked the end of Prohibition, and thus the end of bootleg liquor. So the mob were also looking for new revenue streams. And in 1935, Al Capone's replacement in the Chicago crime syndicate, Frank Niddy, set his eyes on Hollywood. Niddy took two small-time crims, Willie Bioff and George Brown, and muscled them into complete control of the IA, the union. The two men already had been running a labour shakedown racket in Chicago, in the projectionists branch of IA. So all they needed to do was get Brown to stand for election as national IA president. To do this, they stacked out the meetings with armed thugs to threaten anybody who might nominate against him, and Brown was elected to the national presidency unopposed. And then he appointed Bioff as his Los Angeles representative. Having thereby won the elections, Brown immediately used his presidential powers to declare a state of emergency in the union, meaning there would be no more local elections, no more local meetings, nothing. All power and all decisions were concentrated in the hands of Bioff and Brown. They then approached the studio heads with a mutually beneficial plan. Give the pair of them regular cash payments, and in return, their thugs would ensure that there would be no strikes in Hollywood. Now, the pair were later jailed for extortion, as we'll see, but this wasn't, what they were doing in Hollywood right here wasn't extortion. On the contrary, the studio heads loved this idea. They were quite happy to pay off the two. From that moment on, the big five studios were paying Bioff and Brown each $50,000 per year, and the little three studios were paying them each $25,000. Under the gangsters' reign, pay and conditions for the 12,000 workers covered by IA rapidly deteriorated. For starters, Brown instituted a 2% levy on all members, supposedly as an emergency strike fund in a union that was never going to strike. Over the years, the mob collected mountains of cash, and none of this was ever accounted for, and it all went straight into their own pockets. In addition, the union stood by and did nothing while the bosses implemented a never-ending chain of speed-ups and stretch-outs. Worse than nothing, in fact, because anyone who was suspected of organising resistance to all of this risked immediately being blacklisted by the union itself. And in the most glaring indictment of what was happening under their leadership of IA, members whose yearly income had been $2,400 in 1929 were averaging just $1,500 by 1937, and that's not even, adjusted for inflation. In response to the mobsters' takeover of IA, which is, we'll call it IATSE. I'm just calling it IA because one of the factions that emerges here is called itself the IA Progressives. So in response to the mobsters' takeover of the union, those two communists that we mentioned earlier, Jeff Kieber and Irv Henschel, founded a rank-and-file reform group inside IATSE. And they called it the IA Progressives. This is a sample of one of their reform newsletters. Eugene Males was one of those rank-and-file members who they recruited into this reform struggle. And Males wrote of the sort of activities that the group tried to build around, and he wrote also of his own trajectory from just an interested supporter to an active organizer inside the rank-and-file group. He wrote, "I had started working in the studios in January 1937 as a greensman, or as it was later called, a landscape set dresser. At this point, I was more of an observer than a real activist in the progressives. I attended union meetings and faction meetings, but I mostly just listened. With time, I began to ask questions from the floor or to offer an idea. The IA progressives became involved in meetings over the question of year-round employment and tried to generate interest around that issue. They were only partially successful. They issued letters that raised questions about general conditions regarding work. Some attention was given to in the local press and radio, but little came of this. Something spectacular was needed. The FMPC strike offered this possibility." Now, the FMPC was the Federation of Motion Picture Crafts. This coalition formed in 1937 and represented the first significant attempt to unify those Hollywood craft unions that were still outside of the IA. FMPC's founding members included painters, scenic artists, hairdressers, makeup artists, labourers, costumers, draftspersons, plumbers, engineers, boilermakers, machinists, linoleum workers, sheet metal workers, and culinary workers. It's a force. These unions organised to resist further encroachments by the gangsters, and they tried to force the studio heads to recognise and negotiate with genuine unions. On the 3rd of May 1937, a Monday morning, some 8,000 FMPC members walked off the job, and Hollywood was rocked. The Screen Actors Guild, which had been founded not long after the Screen Writers Guild, had initially made some supportive gestures towards FMPC. Of the 2,500 SAG members, some 99% voted to strike alongside the FMPC. But instead, the SAG leadership seized the moment and cut a deal with the studios. And they left the FMPC without the hefty support of the Hollywood stars. Now, this was the start of a very right-wing path for the Screen Actors Guild. Nonetheless, the FMPC strike was solid enough to cause serious, major disruptions to Hollywood production. The IA ordered their members to cross the FMPC picket lines on threat of expulsion and blacklisting. And they also shipped in battalions of the mob's heavies who usually worked security on the Las Vegas casinos. But they underestimated the FMPC. In the FMPC's ranks were a handful of communists and assorted union militants with ties to other industries. One such militant, though importantly not a communist, was the rank-and-file leader of the Painters Union, a former boxer by the name of Herb Sorrell. The FMPC countered the arrival of the Las Vegas security thugs by calling in the support of other blue-collar unions from across LA, including the longshoremen, the steel workers, and the auto workers. And they also organised for wave after wave of university students from the colleges to come and join the picket lines. But the FMPC unions were slowly broken, and one by one, they returned to work. In the end, only 4 unions stood firm: the painters, the scenic artists, the makeup artists, and the hairdressers. And they stayed out until 14th of June, which is about 6 weeks in total. And each of those unions, because they stuck to it, won. They gained significant pay rises, and they gained legal union recognition from the studios. The Painters, under Herb Sorrell, became the first union in Hollywood to have a collective agreement negotiated on the ground in LA by elected representatives of their union instead of by officials somewhere else. For the gangsters Bioff and Brown, the FMPC strike shone a spotlight on their complacency. They hadn't expected such a strong threat to their control of Hollywood labour, and they were rocked by the activities of the IA progressives inside that union, who had agitated forcefully for solidarity with the FMPC strike. So the mob decided to move. It was time to smash the left within IA. And in 1938, acting on the urging of the gangsters, the LAPD's Red Squad raided Jeff Keeber's home. They seized all his Communist Party correspondence and they passed it directly to the press, who plastered it all over the front pages. Keeber was promptly blacklisted. A few weeks later, mobsters beat the crap out of frail, middle-aged communist Irving Henschel, and they even put a hit on his head. To make matters worse, through a complicated kind of story, Henschel was at that time abandoned in Chicago, literally the lion's den of the mob, with no money and no food. But his so-called comrades in the local branch of the CP refused to take his calls or even to be seen talking to him in public, presumably to avoid drawing any heat from the mob. A fortnight after he managed to finally get his way back to LA, Henschel was horrified to see that the CP national press had run a shit sheet on him, falsely accusing him of refusing to follow party directives. Now Henschel, you'll remember I said he never finished high school. He used to tell everyone how proud he was that he was party educated. But in the face of this onslaught from the party, Henschel had a nervous breakdown. He quit the party he loved, that he'd helped build, and to top it off, he found himself blacklisted from the industry. He did manage to come back a few years later as a machinist in Fox Studios, but for a few years he was out of work and out of politics. By the end of 1939, Bioff and Brown seemed unassailable. These gangsters, you know? And among the unions that were still holding meetings, attendance was abysmal. In light of the brazen corruption of the IA officials and the open support that they gained from the studio heads in the face of the biggest democratic rebellion that Hollywood had seen, many members just resigned themselves to total defeat. But a new rebellion was already fermenting, and it was happening in those pockets of the film industry that remained outside of IA's reach and outside of the reach of the mob. And suddenly, almost 2 years later, the fight for democratic trade unions in Hollywood was back on the agenda in a big way. Now, on 23rd of May 1941, Willie Bioff and George Brown were indicted on charges of racketeering and tax evasion. A few months earlier, the Fed's investigation had also convicted and jailed a guy by the name of Joe Shenk. Now, we haven't mentioned him yet because we don't have all day, but for those of you who don't know, Shenk was president of 20th Century Fox, one of the biggest of the big studios. By coincidence, just 5 days after Bioff and Brown were indicted, an energetic 9-week-long wildcat strike broke out in a place that you might not have expected: the Disney Animation Studios. This was one of the most important strikes in Hollywood history. Now, back in 2015, I spent about a year buried in the archives for photos and footage of this strike, and I found some great stuff. As luck would have it, though, the very next year, American PBS released a 2-part doco on Disney, which includes much of the same footage, but at better quality. So I've cut here a kind of excerpt, highlights from the section that talks about the strike. We'll watch this, and then I'm going to expand on it a bit.
The new Burbank studio was a kind of a case study in be careful what you ask for. It was so nice that it was almost sterile. It was all rationalized, it was all organized. And something, the quality of the creative experience was almost designed out of the operation.
There was something unmistakably mechanical at the heart of Walt's workplace utopia. People were segregated by task, as at an industrial plant. Company hierarchy was more rigid, more obvious, and more carefully policed by Disney administrators. The tonier perks accrued to the highest links of the corporate pay chain. Membership in the Penthouse Club, with its gymnasium, steam room, and restaurant, was reserved for top writers and animators, all men still. So were office niceties like area rugs, drapes, easy chairs, and armoires. When animator Don Lusk started doing friends a favor by picking up the slack on lower-level jobs like cleanup and in between, somebody above took note.
I came into the room on a Monday morning, and all was in there was a desk. The rug was gone, the coat closet was gone, my easy fold-out chair was gone, Everything was gone excepting my desk and a chair. Oh, I called up, so I said, what the hell is going on? And they said, well, I'm not animating, so you don't get a rug on the floor.
I missed the old Hyperion place. It was beginning to feel like corporate America. You know, it was just getting too big and you're losing the family touch.
The studio had grown so rapidly that there were all of these folks in the animation process. You know, the assistant animators, the in-betweeners, they didn't know Walt Disney. And they weren't well paid by Walt Disney, as the master animators were. I think Walt Disney's attitude was, look, at anybody can do that stuff. The master animators, that's one thing. But doing in-between work, why am I going to pay them top dollar? They're not artists.
Some of the people who told me about the cafeteria, they said the cafeteria is wonderful, but most of the rank and file artists couldn't afford to eat there. They still had to go out to the sandwich wagon out on the street because the salaries were all over the place. You know, I mean, there were people making $200 and $300 a week and people making $12 a week.
Workers at the bottom of the Disney ladder were starting to grumble in 1940. Now that the company's finances were public, everybody knew the boss was making 5 or 10 times more than the highest paid members of his creative team, and more than 100 times that of the women working in ink and paint. More than a half dozen Hollywood unions and guilds emerged in the late 1930s to bargain for better working conditions and better pay. Among them was the Screen Cartoonists Guild, which offered representation for the animators, assistants, in-betweeners, and ink and paint artists working across the industry. By 1940, the Cartoonists Guild had organized the animation departments at all of the major studios except Disney's, which employed more than half the men and women working in the field of animation.
Even after organizing MGM and Warner Brothers and Screen Gems and George Powell and Walter Lantz, it only came to maybe about 150 people, while Disney's was like 600. If unionism was to work in Hollywood, Disney's was the ultimate battle.
There were plenty of people at Burbank who did not see the labor situation as Walt Disney did, and among them was one of his best animators, Art Babbitt. Babbitt had been with Disney for nearly a decade, contributing to every major film, and almost single-handedly creating the popular character Goofy. He was one of the highest salaried animators on the Burbank lot, but made little effort to hide his sympathies for other animators who had been denied on-screen credits, or for the hundreds of assistants and inkers who were barely eking out a living.
He was rather a large personality. He wasn't subservient to Walt. He didn't have that kind of relationship to him. He was his own man, he was independent, and Walt didn't like it.
Babbitt used to tell the story about a young painter who was making $16 a week, whose husband had run off because of the Great Depression. And what she was doing is that she was skipping lunches because she wanted to keep feeding her family. And one day she actually fainted from malnutrition.
Disney didn't see the problem, and certainly didn't want to hear about it. He was incensed when he learned that the Screen Cartoonists Guild was trying to organize his shop. He was certain he had the right to run his own company as he saw fit. In February of 1941, Walt decided to make his case personally to the men and women working for him. He gathered the staff in the only auditorium at the studio big enough to hold all 1,200 of his employees.
In the 20 years I have spent in this business, I've weathered many storms. It's been far from easy sailing. It's required a great deal of hard work, struggle, determination, confidence, faith, and above all, unselfishness. Some people think that we have class distinction in this place. They wonder why some get better seats in the theater than others. They wonder why some men get spaces in the parking lot and others don't. I have always felt, and always will feel, that the men who contribute the most to the organization should, out of respect alone, enjoy some privileges. My first recommendation to the lot of you is this: put your own house in order. You can't accomplish a damn thing by sitting around and waiting to be told everything. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling and growling, do something about it.
Much of the staff left the auditorium infuriated. This speech recruited more members for the Screen Cartoonists Guild than a year of campaigning, reported one left-wing magazine. Babbitt was now convinced Disney workers needed a real union and signed his Screen Cartoonists Guild membership card, which made him the highest-ranking Disney employee to openly challenge the boss. Walt Disney saw Babbitt's move as a personal betrayal. "I don't care if you keep your goddamn nose glued to the board all day or how much work you turn out," he told Babbitt in the hallway one day. "If you don't stop organizing my employees, I'm going to throw you right the hell out of the front gate." At the end of May 1941, Disney sent a letter of termination to Babbitt, citing as cause union activities. Word of Babbitt's firing shot through the studio in Burbank. Disney employees who supported the Guild met after work the following evening, and by a vote of 315 to 4, determined to take a stand against their boss. When he drove up to his studio gate on May 29, 1941, the picketers were already on the march. Walt Disney was forced to wend his way through more than 200 of his striking workers. Nearly half of the studio's art department had walked out. And it wasn't just the low-wage workers. Some of Disney's most trusted animators were also on the picket line.
The street's full of strikers, not only from Disney, but from other studios, parading back and forth with signs, and this wonderful, idyllic, utopian place is in shambles.
All of a sudden, the moment of the shared, that we are in this together, the victories are all of our victories, that spell gets broken.
As the strike lingered and kept going, the mood of everybody started to get ugly, and people started to get angrier, and then Walt was getting angrier.
A month into the strike, Disney refused to recognize the union representing his workers, the Screen Cartoonists Guild. He refused to negotiate with the Guild's representative, Herbert Sorrell, and he refused to make apologies to the man whose firing had prompted the strike, longtime Disney animator Art Babbitt.
There was one day where Art Babbitt noticed Disney driving to the gate, and Babbitt just kind of blew a stack and just jumped over and grabbed a bullhorn and shouted out loud so everybody could hear, "There he goes, the great man," and basically just heaped abuse on Disney. Shame on you, Walt Disney.
As the crowd cheered, Disney jumped out of his car and charged at Babbitt. The two men had to be pulled apart. Walt Disney could not believe that so many of his workers had actually taken sides with the union and against him. Disney sniffed conspiracy, and a big one. He went public with his pet theory in a full-page advertisement in a Hollywood trade paper, Variety.
he needed to have a bad guy. He needs to blame it all on a villain. And in this case, the new flavor of the month at Hollywood at that time and later would be the shadow or specter of communism.
He becomes then like a typical industrial boss. Most American executives at the time blame unionization on communists. So in this way, Disney becomes completely conventional.
The next day, Disney skipped town for a 10-week working tour of South America and left the headaches to his brother and longtime business partner, Roy. This was just fine with Roy. He was happy to have Walt and his explosive temper remain at a safe remove while he tried to make peace with the Screen Cartoonists Guild.
Roy Disney sees the writing on the wall. He sees that unionization is coming into the studios, whether we like it or not, and he wants to settle this. He wants to get things up and running.
By the time Walt did finally return at the end of October, Roy had resolved the strike. The workers had been granted almost everything they had asked for. The Disney Art Department was back on track.
Of course, the Disney picket line being run by artists meant that this was a picket line unlike others you've ever seen, with the best signs, the best placards. The musicians and the caterers were out on strike. There was constant music. There was a big open-air canteen across the road because the kitchen staff were on strike with them. Workers at other studios would come down in solidarity, including the prop and costume departments from Warner Brothers, who actually found out one day that it was Walt Disney's birthday. So on that day, they made a life-size effigy of Walt and a fully functioning guillotine. And they marched it across Hollywood to the Disney studios, to the picket line, chanting slogans and led by 4 large men dressed as executioners. Upon reaching the Disney picket line, they sung "Happy Birthday" and swiftly chopped off the effigy's head. You'll see photos and videos of that online. I'm not going to take up time now, but it's amazing stuff. Now, the Brown and Bioff, remember, have been exposed and they're facing jail. And there's an energetic union waging and winning strikes for the first time since 1937. So for the first time in all those years, Hollywood unions by 1941, for those outside of IA, were finding a new confidence. And soon, not long after the Disney strike, the Screen Cartoonists Guild joined together with the fragments of the old FMPC, who'd led the big 1937 strike, and they merged under the leadership of Herb Sorrell. And they founded a new alliance, calling themselves the Conference of Studio Unions, the CSU. At least two rebel branches of the IA broke away and then affiliated to the new CSU. And the remnants of the IA progressives, the rank and file group inside IA, maintained close comradely ties with the new CSU. Now, those IA progressives hadn't been totally beaten back in 1939. Jeff Keeber had been blacklisted and was long gone, but Gene Mayles and Irv Henschel had managed to get their jobs back and resume their activities. By 1941, they were now working fastidiously and much more secretly to build up a database of supporters inside IA. And they made countless phone calls, had secret coffees with people, went to barbecues, even organized children's birthday parties as a cover for doing their rank and file recruitment. Now, the IA members might have seen the last of Bioff and Brown, but the gangsters' bureaucrats carried on as if nothing had changed. Their chosen successor was the arch-reactionary Ray Brewer, and he now ran IA, or IATSE. And Brewer would soon carve a name for himself alongside the IA's new president of the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan. Together, these two made it their mission to drive out the remnants of the left from the Hollywood union movement. And the crunch came in March 1945, when the CSU was forced to defend its jurisdiction over a few dozen set decorators, and they ended up launching a massive strike that shut down most of the studios. And it brought the moguls, the studio moguls, to their knees. But this was, unfortunately, to be the last hurrah for the union militants in Hollywood. Now, how did it unfold? On that first day, 10,500 workers struck, and they established picket lines with hundreds of workers at each of the major studios. As the weeks went by, their numbers were swelled as more and more unions voted to join the strike. Irv Henschel and Gene Mayles from the IA Progressives were expelled from the IA during this strike after they'd called an unauthorized mass meeting of some 2,000 IA members, and that meeting voted unanimously to refuse to cross the CSU picket lines. And this was in direct defiance of the IA officials who had ordered them to scab. Eventually, the range of unions on strike alongside the CSU was shutting down every aspect of production, including the usually quiet white-collar guilds like the Screen Analysts Guild and the Screen Publicists Guild, and the 3,000 members of the Studio Office Employees Guild, who were mostly women. After 7 months, on the 9th of October 1947, the situation reached all-out war, as the mob, the cops, the studio heads banded together and unleashed hell on the pickets. Now, the figures vary, but they're somewhere approaching in the range of 800 picketers being arrested that morning. Elaine Spiro, an 18-year-old actress on her very first picket line and in defiance of her own union's leaders, was there, and she describes the scene. She writes, 1,000 pickets confronted by police armed with semi-automatic rifles. Then a large open cattle truck pulled up nearby, and about 50 tall, muscular men emerged from the rear with chains. Then about 100 helmeted LA County deputy sheriffs and lots of studio cops running at us with batons at the ready. Goons and scabs smashing people's heads, faces, bodies. Deputy sheriffs and cops knocking people down. A girl wearing a white hard hat and a Red Cross armband pushed down into the pavement by a scab. The cops dragging people into the paddy wagons. 3 cops beating up a bleeding man lying on the ground. Studio police threw canisters of tear gas at us from the roof of the building. Now, Spiro soon quit acting. She's 18 when she does this, right? She soon quit acting and she became a social worker. But in an interview in 1998, at the age of 71, Spiro remained proud of standing her ground that day in pursuit of democratic unionism. And this is what many historians miss. They paint the CSU strike as simply a jurisdictional dispute between 2 rival craft unions, the CSU versus IA. But this misses the fundamental point. The IA was a tame cat company union built on sweetheart deals with the studio heads and packed with gangsters and careerists. The CSU was a democratic grassroots alternative that held out the promise of Hollywood studio workers finally having control over their own organizations and the right to collectively bargain for their own working conditions. And it's this basic principle that gave all those workers, like Elaine Spiro, the confidence and courage to defy such a brutal onslaught. The strike was eminently supportable, of course, and progressive. The 1945 strike ended in a victory of sorts, but the underlying dispute dragged on until 1947, and it flared up again in a series of further strikes and lockouts, each time with the studios managed to squeeze harder. On a single day in November 1946, for example, the studios uniformly sacked about 10,000 CSU members, with a subsequent lockout provoking another round of picketing and police brutality. And finally, by 1948, the CSU were broken. In a climate of extreme anti-communist hysteria, their leadership were blacklisted, some of them were jailed, and they were all removed from the Hollywood film industry. That CSU strike took place during the CP's wartime anti-strike policy, and hence the party did not officially support the strike. This is despite the feverish claims of the yellow unions and the studio heads and the gangsters, and later of the HUAC and the historians. Individual CP activists on the ground played vital roles, and these activists were genuine activists, genuine communists, but the CP's line from the outset was that this was a strike that shouldn't have happened and couldn't win. Needless to say, this predisposed the party to do nothing to spread the strike or to actually help it win. And defeat then became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, even in 1946, the year of the biggest strike wave in US history, the CP continued their no-strike policy, declaring that it had never intended to be solely for the duration of the war. Herb Sorrell, meanwhile, was able to pull key sections of the film industry's workforce behind him, and by 1941, his painters had the best pay in the film industry. But for all his commitment to union democracy and his belief in the power of striking, Sorrell had weak political nous, and the CP, in their shrewd efforts to undermine the strike, attacked Sorrell relentlessly over this, sneering at him, sneering about his lack of education and his alleged inability to grasp the complicated balance of class forces. We shouldn't let the defeat of the strike and the smashing of the CSU retrospectively confirm those arguments. An organisation that cohered the most militant workers in Hollywood could have, potentially, found a way through the maze of Hollywood labour organising. The fact is, with the exception of a few individuals, the Communist Party never even tried. And the price that was paid by workers inside Hollywood and beyond was enormous. The defeat of the CSU strikes and the smashing of the CSU allowed IA to enshrine a moribund company union approach that, persisted for decades. And today, the industry remains as deadly as it was in the 1920s. Which gives you a feel for why right now, one of the reasons we're seeing talk about another strike, actually organised by IATSE, is because of issues partly around issues to do with safety. Now, the victors of the battle in 1945-46 also used that victory to pursue historic attacks on the rest of the working class, with Truman actually referencing the CSU strikes as a justification for the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act. That legislation gutted the country's labour movement of its radical core for decades to come. And finally, the crushing of the CSU opened the way for a massive escalation of the Red Scare and the ramping up of the HUAC assaults, which is a grim irony given that the CP's role, was to help the defeat of the strikes. The Hollywood CP branch might have been the biggest outside of New York by 1940, but it also produced the largest number of rats, as a seemingly never-ending parade of ex-communists hauled their pathetic frames before HUAC and named names. There are many important exceptions, of course, and one such figure that I'd never heard of until I started researching for this topic was William F. Blowitz. He was active in the Screen Publicists Guild, that oddly militant union of press release writers and tour guides, who carried the CSU strike into the quietest corners of Hollywood. Blowitz quit the Communist Party after the defeat of the strikes, and in a revealing incident, when Blowitz himself was hauled before HUAC, they only got as far as the first question, "Are you now or have you ever been a communist?" Blowitz replied, yes, he had been, but he'd quit that damn party. It's because they'd worked so hard to undermine the strike. He explained, "I felt like it was a correct strike, which should have been won by ordinary methods of the labour union, but the party was opposed to Herb Sorrell all the way through." Now, given the whole point of the hearing was to prove that the CSU strike was actually a communist plot, the witch hunters were caught off guard. They promptly excused Blowitz with no further questions and never subpoenaed him again. Now, this history is one that has seldom been told. Hollywood itself has ignored it, with the strikes never being represented on screen until a few years ago, the biopic of communist writer Dalton Trumbo. You might recall that film has some reenactments of the 45-46 picket lines, but it presents them only briefly, with no context and no explanation. And they seem to serve merely as visual cues to set the flavour of the times, like the 1940s wallpaper and the 1940s costumes. But for those of us who are interested in the challenges of organising workers in large new industries that didn't exist just a generation ago and whose workers are heavily casualised, we can learn a lot from the history of the radical left unions, the activists inside Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s, and even their eventual failure teaches us a lot. And I'm going to finish with a couple of historical curiosities for us on the left. Now, it's true that the CP was the only left-wing force organising in Hollywood. But the genuine revolutionaries of the US Socialist Workers' Party, who'd led the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters Rebellion, seem to have had at least a couple of members on the fringes of the fight. And certainly their paper, The Militant, gave coverage to the struggle and was forthright in its support for the CSU strikes. It gives us a glimpse of how things might have unfolded differently had a revolutionary force to the left of the CP actually been able to intervene into the class struggle of Hollywood's golden era. And finally, I'll end with these two artworks by the painter Hans Burkhart, who went on to become very famous. But back in 1945, Burkhart was strapped for cash and was just a young furniture painter in the MGM studios. Within 2 weeks of starting the job, he found himself out on strike with the CSU, and he was disgusted by the scabbing behaviour of the Screen Actors Guild in particular. So in 1946, he painted these two portraits of SAG President Ronald Reagan, and I'm certain these must be the first in what became a decades-long mass cultural phenomenon of anti-Ronald Reagan artworks. So it all started here with the painting on the left, Reagan, Blood Money, and the painting on the right, Studio Scab, Ronald Reagan. So I'll finish there.